one seems very sure how to run the railways. Are we approaching the end of the line for British Rail as we know it now? The latest report, so far from pointing the way ahead, offers instead a series of unpalatable options which the government might prefer to leave on one side until after the election. Vincent Hanna will be asking Transport Secretary David Howell what he's going to do and whether crucial decisions can be put off any longer. Sir Peter Parker and British Rail hoped for great things from the Serpell Report. They believed it would endorse their faith in the future of the railways by urging the government to invest heavily in electrification. It didn't. In fact, it didn't recommend anything. Instead, it laid out a series of options for a railway system of different sizes and shapes, some of them much smaller, along with the costs involved. Now, that puts the ball firmly back into the government's court, inviting the Transport Secretary, David Howell, to make a clear decision himself on what sort of railway he wants and what it should cost. His dilemma is that in an election year, any decision in any direction could be damagingly unpopular with somebody. Vincent Hanna reports.
It's not easy to find a railway like this. It's unsubsidized, efficient, and doesn't have industrial disputes. It doesn't have passengers, driver, or guards either. The Post Office automatic mail train has been running under London since 1927. But for British Rail, life in the daylight is harsher. £37 million worth of British Rail rolling stock lies idle in the weeds of a Cricklewood siding. Intended for use on the Bedford-St Pancras line, which British Rail electrified at a cost of £150 million, it cannot start because the rail drivers haven't yet been offered enough to persuade them to operate the trains without guards. And the old trains rumble expensively by. It reflects the perennial problems of Britain's railway system, underfunded and overmanned, a declining minority choice of transport into which the British public is currently pouring £1 billion a year.
People are attached to railways, of course. I loved my clockwork railway. My two boys were quite fond of their electric railway. But their children, I suspect, won't be playing with trains at all.
Alfred Goldstein wrote the minority report of the Serpell Committee on British Rail Finances, which caused a political storm when it was published last Thursday. The report was ordered by the government last May at the request of Sir Peter Parker, British Rail's chairman. Now, he had hoped that Serpell would help him get a massive new investment programme for the railways, a programme which he feels is desperately overdue.
1983 is a make-or-break year for the railway in the sense that we have now got to make decisions about the way the railway is going to develop over the 80s and what goes on into the 90s and the next century. This year, decisions must be taken about the size and quality of the network. If they're not taken now, we can't correct the position in time. So in that sense, it's make or break.
But British Rail, and Sir Peter particularly, have been shocked by the Serpell report, published finally last Thursday after many leaks. For BR's current network of 11,000 miles, there are no firm recommendations about investment policy, or indeed its political future. Instead, there are a series of stark options based on the premise that if public money is to be saved, large cuts in the network will be necessary. Option A slashes the network to 1,630 route miles, with no services north of Edinburgh or west of Cardiff. And cut off from all rail links would be Sheffield, Nottingham, Derby and Swansea, and most of Britain's collieries, which are British Rail's biggest freight customers. This network, says the report, would make a profit of £34 million a year. Option B is basically the same as A, but adds in most of the commuter services in London and the South East, and, says Serpell, it would lose £19 million a year. There were 4 other options of differing size, but all of them operating at an annual deficit of between £500 and £800 million a year. Now, the basis of the committee's work has been challenged. even though it claims only to give advice to the government in alternative forms. But reactions have been as extreme as they have been diverse.
I'm appalled by it. I really am horrified. It's a look through narrow, monetarist binoculars at a certain set of financial equations which would be laughed out of court in most countries. It ignores the needs of passengers, it ignores the energy needs of the country, it ignores the environmental and social impact of doing away with railway lines, and I think it could have only been produced in response to this government. I can't think of a previous Tory government, let alone a Labour government, which would have given 2 minutes' time to a report of this kind.
The trouble with the Serpell Report is that it was produced very rapidly. The people responsible had to produce a computer model of British Rail, which British Rail itself hasn't had the time and money to produce. And they had to produce it in only 3 months because they didn't start until halfway through the investigation. As a result, there are all sorts of anomalies in it, things that don't make sense. Take the basic case where they have this minimum railway which is profitable. It's profitable because passenger traffic loses 30-odd million, but freight makes a profit of 60 million. But all the lines that carry coal in the East Midlands, in South Yorkshire, in Nottinghamshire, they aren't there. Now, the whole basis of the freight business is that it carries coal. As a result, that basic case would probably lose something like 100 million a year, not make a profit, because the freight trains are assumed to be running on the system, but the lines that join them to the coal mines and the power stations have been taken out. It's a complete nonsense.
British Rail passenger services fare no better in the Serpell computer, and as a result of the noisy criticisms of the committee's methodology and financial assumptions, all reasoned debate has so far been drowned in a flood of recrimination. But complaining about Serpell can't hide a few unpalatable facts about rail travel. Apart from the intercity services and the southeast commuter traffic, people in Britain seldom use railways. Those who do are currently subsidised by the taxpayer to the tune of £810 million. Some branch and country lines are operated at a loss which is so enormous as to be ridiculous. And if these London commuters were asked to pay the full commercial price for their tickets, their fares would have to go up by at least 40%. In considering the future of rail services, then, the contention of the Serpell Committee is that the argument in the end comes down to money and what, politically, you choose to do with it.
I'm not a financier or an accountant. I look at money simply as a measure of resources, and that measure is limited. We simply can't take the view that we can have everything we want. There's a limit to the amount that we can have, and you can't get away from the fact that what you have in one area, you don't have in the other.
So the government, in essence, has got to decide how much money the public are prepared to lose on the railway network.
Or, I wouldn't put it in those terms of loss, I would put it as to what extent, in comparison with health, education, welfare, travel and transport is to be subsidized. It's got to decide, first, what kind of railway we want over the next 20 years, and an important part of that decision will be to decide what sort of cost the country ought to be devoting towards that kind of railway.
That's all very well, but Peter Parker's point is that Serpell could have helped by pointing the way towards the right decision. For, left to themselves, politicians can be somewhat elusive.
You know, I've had 5 secretaries of state, so I'm not being personal about anybody. Each one of them has said to me, Peter, this is a terribly difficult job, you know. And we know that it's rolling stock and your traction is going out of date. But, and we know you have all these difficulties, and there's a Himalayan range of investment in arrears you've got to catch up with eventually. But for the moment, can't you just keep going? Now, I had that honestly when I was put in the job by Crossland. And I remember telling him, this is the only job I've been put in where no one can tell me what winning means. I had 2 months, briefly, of Peter Shaw. Then I had Bill Rogers saying the same thing. We understand your investment problems to come, but can you hang on till 80, 81? He wasn't there in 80, 81. With Fowler, we had the same sort of thing, but then, of course, he's moved on. David Howell had the courage to set up the review that we're now battling with. They all tend to come to the same conclusion. We do see your needs long-term, but can't you hang on with this crumbling edge of quality in the short term?
Parker argues that such procrastination has stolen the chances of a successful British advanced passenger train. That's the one with the tilt, which has been continually promised next year since 1977. British Rail has spent £40 million in its development, money which the Serpell Report feels could have been put to better use. But it's difficult to make any proper judgment about projects like the APT, given the refusal of successive governments to work out a coherent transport policy. Money has been spread around on British Leyland, on road building, or on railways without any long-term coordination. That could never be said of France, where they take a long-term view of railway finance, and as a result, their quality never crumbles. They not only believe in railways, but find the political will to express that belief in an integrated transport policy. This is their advanced passenger train, which doesn't tilt. It's called the TGV, and on which they have invested £340 million, 8 times British Rail's figure. It runs from Paris to Lyon at 170 miles per hour in 2 hours 40 minutes, shortly to be cut to 2 hours, and a single ticket costs £17. Now that's the same distance as London to Newcastle, which with British Rail takes 3¼ hours and costs £30. Assured of government support, French engineers simply drew a line across France and built a brand new track for the TGV for a further £500 million. French Railways' annual investment programme is 4 times that of Britain, and Germany and Italy also far outspend us. They all see railways as a long-term, prestigious investment and are prepared to pay for it. And it's not just their technical efficiency we might envy. British Rail employs 16 workers for every mile of track in its network. The French employ only 12.
They, in France, have kept the sense of sort of la gloire. They've kept the capability of pride. They've not unnerved themselves worrying about their weaknesses constantly. You know, we have one of the best railways in the world. By independent standards, not mentioned in these reports, alas, we came out as the most cost-effective railway in the world. We're operating in 30 countries in the world. I had a letter the other day from the chairman of the Real BR, Bangladesh Railway. You know, we are selling our services on track maintenance to the World Bank. Now, we have one of the great railways of the world, and yet here we are living in a sort of drizzle of demoralizing reports. And I've had about 6 major reports on this railway in 6 years. Now, when I think of my French equivalent number, I really look at him with some envy, and I wonder, you know, I was born a Frenchman. I mean, I was born in France, of English parents, but they have this generous attitude that when you're 21, you could become a Frenchman.
Might have been chairman of SNCF.
But if I'd known I was going to have a railwayman, my God, I might well have taken a different decision in those years ago. Because the way they go about the railway, it isn't what we have in the wet hand tactics. You know, you grab it and then let it go, grab it and let it go. They have that great train, the TGV, train de grande vitesse, the equivalent of a high-speed train. They built a special track for it, and doesn't it go?
French investment in fast trains is as nothing compared to their achievement in restructuring the entire transport system of Paris. It took 10 years and billions of pounds. Now, 3 new high-speed lines with distinctive rolling stock have been grafted onto the existing underground or metro, each line with its own name. The Eric line speeds passengers in from Paris airport in 20 minutes to the Gare du Nord, which has been reconstructed as part of government policy into a new integrated centre. The fully automated system operates on 3 levels and is unlocked by the commuters who use orange cards, bought weekly, usually at half the cost of London tickets. The cards are good for trains, underground, and even on the integrated bus system. To create this transport planner's paradise involves more than money. It is a statement of consistent political commitment. Britain's one serious attempt at a locally integrated transport system is in Tyne and Wear, where the metro serves 1.25 million people on 34 miles of track, which they actually took over from British Rail. It uses lightweight trams and has manning practices that Peter Parker must envy. British Rail have been slightly snooty about the metro, possibly because they don't run it themselves and haven't yet fully integrated with it. But at stations like Heworth, there is automation à la Paris, adjacent bus services, through tickets, and much local enthusiasm.
Well, obviously, this is a very high productivity system. We have 90% one-person operated buses. The trains are single man. There's one person to a train driving it, otherwise no one. No one on the stations, just ticket inspectors going around the system. It's a very high productivity system. We need, of course, the ridership that goes with that. Productivity doesn't make any sense unless you've got the passengers.
And are you getting the passengers?
Yes, we're doing the business. We're pulling in new people from cars onto the system. As a matter of fact, we're also pulling people onto the rail part of it as well, because it links up with Metro. There's been the first time for many, many years there's been a growth in passengers on our local British Rail line, and that is largely due to Metro. But of course they haven't had the investment, they haven't got the rolling stock, they haven't got the stations. It's all clapped out.
But projects like the Metro are hideously expensive. This one cost £300 million to build and is subsidised by local ratepayers to the tune of £14 million a year. It's part of the reason why sections of Conservative opinion are so hostile to investment in railways. And Mrs. Thatcher herself is widely believed to have strong views.
Well, it's an open secret, I suppose, that the Prime Minister is anti-railway. I've been told that when she first went to the board, there was a total non-meeting of minds at lunch. And she travels very rarely, if at all, by British Rail. In fact, I think the only recent time she's been on a railway was when she went to Hong Kong, where Britain built the mass transit railway, and she travelled on that example of private enterprise. So it might well say that this confirms her prejudices about railways, and if she gets back after the election for a bigger majority and a longer term, yes, that is the joker in the pack. Not what will transport experts or the Department of Transport think about Serpell, but what does the Prime Minister think, because she's such a powerful lady.
One of the people who has the ear of the Prime Minister is Alfred Sherman.
90% of goods and passenger mileage is already carried by the roads, and yet this really goes over streets. British Rail has over 10 times the mileage that the motorways have, and a lot of that is going through crowded metropolitan areas and cities. If that were converted into roads, simply tarmacked over, because they have the right of way and they have a good road bed, that would take the heavy traffic, the through traffic, off the streets. It would move it much more quickly, and it would allow the streets to breathe again. It would make life tolerable for people in our towns and suburbs.
Is there enough space to actually transform it into roads?
Oh yes, that's been worked out very easily. A two-track railway track can make a two-lane road, and there's a good deal of ground on the sides for entry, exit, warehouses, parking and the rest. We could really have a magnificent road system if we used the rail tracks, the right-of-way that British Rail built in the 19th century when it was so much easier to acquire and build.
It would be a naive politician who thought he could easily get away with selling road conversion to railway users. And David Howell, the Transport Secretary, is well aware that the majority of these rail commuters into London at the last general election voted for Mrs. Thatcher, just as many of the threatened country branch lines are in Conservative-held seats. But Howell is under all sorts of pressure. He has to find a successor to Peter Parker in June, and his task would be easier if by then he knew what he intended to do about the Serpell Report. Of course, even if he did know, he may feel politically unable to tell anyone in case it costs the government votes. So the attractions of procrastination must seem to him to be considerable, at least until after the next election, when, who knows, the job and the headache might be someone else's.
I think he will attempt to compromise, to take something which is an option to put less money into BR than they need to maintain its present network, and somehow foist the responsibility onto them to propose cuts, because they cannot intelligently, as a board, say we can go on running our present total network given our present investment support by government. That is not a realistic option.
How do you react to the idea of putting it off until after the election? What would happen?
Well, Peter Parker said this was make or break year. His board produced a report on rail policy which said that if investment was kept at its present level, in a decade they'd have to close down 3,000 track miles, they'd have to put a lot more of the network under restriction. So I think putting it off is a way of condemning the railway system to a decline in quality of service and to put it in a financial straitjacket, which must mean curtailment of railway services.
Now, with me is the Transport Secretary, David Howell. In the House of Commons on Thursday, you said that Serpell Report gives you a basis for decisions and for action. Now, when exactly are you going to make that decision?
Well, as you've seen in the films we've been watching, we're talking about something going back a long time, since nationalisation, and we're talking about looking ahead many years. I think the Serpell Report enjoins me to look forward at least 10 years, and many people say we should look forward 20 years. So these can't be snap decisions. We can't just rush after 4 days after a report comes out into decisions looking years ahead and shaping our railway years ahead.
But there are two basic points in the Serpell Report. One which says you can make the railways pay their way if you have drastic cuts, and the other which says railways will need continuing heavy investment from the public. Which side do you incline towards?
Well, it doesn't quite say that. I mean, the railways is a complicated business. We've seen a whole variety of views. Indeed, a lot of these views explain why we have inherited a railway system that is not all that everybody desires. Among other things, the Serpell Report says that it is with the present level of investment and the present level of government grant, it should be possible to maintain a railway system and get some savings and therefore divert more money into investment. That's one thing they say. That's for the immediate future, and I'd like to get on with that.
Which would you incline towards? Because there is a view which says that the railways, and there's a view not far removed from some of your colleagues, which says that the railway should stand at its own commercial feet. Now, have you sympathy with that view? Do you think it should, or do you think the present level of investment or something near it should continue?
Well, I think parts of the railway should run more commercially. In fact, we've said, and successive governments have said, that the intercity system, which is a very high-quality system, Peter Parker was quite right, it can match anything in the world, should be able to wash its own face, to pay its way. But I believe there is bound to be social railway as well. There's bound to be...
Inevitably, for the future.
Because as I think Mr. Goldstein, you had him on the programme, he pointed out that if you keep people on the railways, that does ease some of the enormous congestion on the road. So there's a social gain there. And I think there is bound to be a need for support for the railways in the future. But the question is how much. As you said, it's a minority who travel on it. I think about 7% of all passengers travel on it. Yet every family in the land puts about 50 quid a year into the railway system, whether they go near it or not. That's about £1 billion in all. And the question is whether that's the kind of way that people want to spend their resources, or could they do better?
You see, I detect a subtle but clear change of government language over the past year. There's a series of quotes for you, which I have here, 14 over the past 3 years, in which you've said, and your predecessors have said, without equivocation, there will be no substantial cuts in the network, no qualification at all. But on Thursday, no less than 4 times, you added, for the first Secretary of State in recent living memory to do this, you added an important qualification. You said, if that policy were changed, it would be after long and informed debate. Now, I want to ask you clearly, has the question of drastic cuts been ruled out after Serpell, or is there a change in policy afoot?
No, the whole point of a report like this and starting a debate like this, which is never a comfortable affair, heaven knows, because so many people have so many views, the whole point is to ask some questions that need asking, rather than just staggering on. That is.
But why ask a question when your predecessors and yourself have said there's no point in asking it because you're not going to do it? Does that mean you're now considering, say, the options A and B, those draconian cuts? Are you considering them?
We're looking at a whole range of options, and the Serpell Report has opened them up, I think, in a very valuable way. Again, going back to Peter Parker, he said what is needed from successive governments and what he's failed to get is the clear objectives about what kind of railway people are prepared to pay for. Now, he talked about investment, and I want to see good investment in the railways, but you showed some investment in the railways sitting there with weeds growing around it because all the money had been spent, but the equipment wasn't running because of restrictive practices. Now,
what are you going to do about the absurd country lines that we've read so much about, the ones which the passenger subsidy is so high that it will be almost cheaper to pay them to take taxis?
Well, I think the first question, and I mean, again, this is 4 days out from a major report asked for by British Rail and raising fundamental questions. The first question that follows from that is just look at the enormous cost of railways where it costs 5 times to run them what you'll get back in revenue. Is that really the best way of providing transport in a particular area? Let the people who are supposedly benefiting or supposedly paying have a say in whether that's the best way to run things. So that's an excellent example of the kind of question that's been closed down for too long, and it's high time it was opened up.
There have been reports, and I must tell you, I have been told by sources within the government, it won't surprise you this, that your initial reaction was to be inclined to put the Serpell report back and consider the options further. But there were others in the government who said you mustn't rule out the possibility of draconian cuts. Is that right?
Well, I don't think really that I would go through the whole business of getting a report like this put together if then the whole thing was merely to shelve it. It isn't like that. First of all,
the election.
Well, we're looking years ahead. We can be asked to look 10, 20 years ahead. You can't judge a gigantic undertaking like this in terms of very short-term perspectives at all. It would be absurd. There's no intention of shelving this report. I think it's got some very, very valuable elements in it, and we've got to build on them.
Can you tonight tell me if you are ruling out the draconian cuts in options A and B that we showed tonight on the screen? Are they ruled out, or do they remain a political possibility?
I think we've got to look at many of the options. We mustn't have... I'm not going to sit here and say we've decided immediately after a few days we know exactly what to do for the future. I think all these things have got to be examined, and we're not going to make snap judgments.
You don't rule them out?
I believe, as I said in the House of Commons, that the extreme propositions, which I think go one end towards spending $4 billion, I mean, it would make the French expenditure look small, and the other end, virtually closing the whole thing down altogether, are ruled out, because I think we want a good modern railway system in the future.
Does that mean the options we showed tonight?
But within that, there are opportunities for us to see which way we want to spend this very large sum of money, and we must examine those first and come to conclusions, not in a couple of hours or a couple of days, but in the months ahead.
Looking back, is it not clear now that the terms of reference were too restrictive? Because surely the future role of railways can only be judged in terms of an overall transport policy, which, with respect, you haven't got.
Well, they were concerned with the railway's immediate financial problems and with looking 20 years ahead. But obviously, the view 20 years ahead for the railway has got to be related to what else we use for, in the transport scene. The railways themselves have argued, British Rail has argued, slightly different from the railways, British Rail have argued that they'd be ready to run highly efficient regular buses on some routes instead of trains and still save money. Now, that's an example of looking at the broader picture than just the railway scene.
Yes, but one of the saddest things I read in the Hansard report, you said that what remains to be determined is other questions such as the relationship between road and rail services and subsidies for public transport generally. Why on earth has that never been considered before in such detail? I mean, why are we still waiting after 30 years of nationalisation to wait for a transport policy?
I think the best answer was in the programme you've shown, people with endless disagreement and an inability to face up to some of the really difficult issues. Now, we are facing up to them. This government...
Including politicians, too.
I think they are. This government didn't come in to just bury all these issues once again under the carpet. We're looking again at the whole scene of the nationalised industries, which we inherited from 30 years ago. I'm not at all sure that nationalised industries in the structure we know them are the best thing for this country at all.
A brief final question. Given the number of people whom you might offend by whatever decision you make, are you surprised that I'm a little cynical about the certainty of you making a firm decision before the election?
I'm not surprised at your cynicism or anybody else's, but I think you've got to reckon, as Peter Parker did and others, that we've had the courage to raise these issues and look at them, and this government is determined to make some progress where others have again and again pushed things under the carpet.
Secretary of State, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Richard.
David Howell, Transport Secretary, talking to Vincent Hanna. Well, that's all from Panorama tonight. We'll be back next Monday, as usual, at 8:10. Until then, good night.